Hi there, my name is Jeremy Navarro, and homosexuality is not a sin. Hopefully that caught your attention. So I want to introduce myself if you guys don't know who I am. Like I said, my name is Jeremy Navarro, and unfortunately, this message is not coming from someone who represents the church. I personally don't go to church anymore. I haven't gone in quite a while. And I do wish that more people in the church shared the message I'm about to share. But I do want you guys to know that it doesn't mean that I don't know what I'm talking about. So while I was still involved in church, I did do ministry for 12 years, ranging from children all the way up to adults. And during that time, I would teach Sunday school. I preached different sermons. I also attended 2 different Christian colleges for a total of 5 years. And had I graduated, which I was just a little shy, had I graduated, I would have had an associate's degree in biblical studies. So even though I don't represent the church, I at least do know a little bit of what I'm talking about today. So as I kind of opened up with, homosexuality is not a sin, and this is what I'm saying is according to the Bible. And so a lot of times when you hear of Christians talking against homosexuality as a sin, and also just to kind of say this, I'm going to mention homosexuality because that's what the Bible says, but obviously these words do apply to everyone in the LGBTQ plus community. But for sake of what the Bible says, I'll be using the term homosexuality. So a lot of times they start back in Leviticus, which is in the Old Testament, and I think that's an appropriate place to start today. And I think the reason Leviticus gets brought up a lot is because there's actually 2 different scriptures pretty close together that talk about this. And so the first one we're going to look at is Leviticus 18:22. Which says, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable." And then we look a little bit further into Leviticus 20:13, which says, "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads." So when you look at that, it's kind of difficult to argue that homosexuality is not a sin because it seems pretty clear cut right there. However, to really understand the Bible, you have to do what's called exegesis. And exegesis it's an investigation into the history and the origins of text, which you look at the historical and cultural background of that time and that area. And you also want to look at who the author is and who the audience is. So if we apply this act of exegesis into the scripture, we see something that's a little bit different. So the first thing we want to talk about is the audience. So today, as modern day Christians, is this book written for you? The answer is no, it is not. About 14 times throughout the book of Leviticus, it says, "Speak unto the children of Israel." Now, the children of Israel are not Christians. Those are the early Jews, which, yes, through their lineage came Jesus Christ, and upon his death opened up a new covenant, but we're going to get into that in a little bit later. But this book is pertaining specifically talking to the early Jews. So why was Leviticus written? Throughout the whole Old Testament, you're going to see a name pop up, and that name is Moloch. Now, Moloch is actually another god that many, many people worship for many hundreds of years. And the main way that you worshiped Moloch was through children sacrifice and through various sexual acts. And the children of Israel had a lot of them had fallen into this worship of Moloch. So what the word is, Leviticus is also known as the Holiness Code. And this was spoke unto Moses to give unto the children of Israel as a way to separate themselves from the people that were worshiping Moloch through the animal sacrifice and through the ritualistic sex to a false god. And this is really important to know that that is why this was written, and it's not written for us. And if you need some further proof that this is not for us, all we have to do is look at some of the other rules that pop up in Leviticus. And I'm going to read a few of them. And again, this is just a few of the many, many rules that are specifically found throughout Leviticus. And as I'm reading along, see if you've ever broken any of these. Do not plant your field with 2 kinds of seed. That's not a metaphor. That literally means, you're growing your fields and stuff out there. Do not wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of materials. Do not cut hair at the side of your heads or clip the edges of your beard. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourself, which that's a big one, as you can see, I have definitely broken. And also, if you're confused on the best way to sacrifice your animal, Leviticus has you covered. There are plenty of passages on the right and the wrong way to sacrifice your animal, which is obviously something that's very important for us today. I, of course, say that in jest, hoping that you understand that this book is not written for us in modern day audiences. So we need to stop looking at the Old Testament. If you consider yourself a modern day Christian, as I had mentioned, Jesus' death ushered in a new covenant, which means we really should be focusing on the New Testament. So why don't we go ahead and jump over to the New Testament and see what that says about homosexuality. The first one we're going to look at is Romans. And I'll explain a little bit about what this book is and why it was written, but let's go ahead and read the passage first and see if it's pretty clear. This is Romans 1:24 through 27. Therefore, God gave over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts, and even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their errors. So again, now that we're looking at New Testament and you look at that, it again seems pretty clear that it's saying homosexuality is a sin. And also, interestingly enough, this seems to be the one and the only time the book actually talks about lesbians. But let's go ahead and break down a little bit of this passage. So who was it written for? Why was it written? All that stuff. This was written by the Apostle Paul, who wrote many books of the New Testament. And when I say books, it's actually important to note that these were not books, these were actually letters. This particular one in Romans is written to the churches in Rome. Hence the title. Little fun fact, the church in Rome were kind of smaller home churches spread throughout the whole city. So he was kind of addressing every Christian that lived in Rome, not just to one particular church, which you find sometimes in some of the other letters he wrote. And it's important to understand why he wrote these letters is because this idea of Christianity was a relatively new thing because Jesus had only just recently died. So there was a lot of questions on the right way and the wrong way to do certain things. And so Paul spends a lot of time writing to these churches to address some of these issues that pop up. So let's go ahead and look at this particular issue and see what they're talking about. It's important to understand that these people, the bigger problem that they're addressing in this whole book of Romans, if you kind of take a step back and look, it's addressing people who have heard the teachings of Christ, some of them maybe firsthand, but they're still ignoring him and they're worshiping false idols, which again is still a problem they had all the way back in Leviticus. It's still a problem that was applying to them today. So Paul is kind of talking to some of these people about how to, again, distance yourself from these people that are worshiping false idols. But let's look a little bit deeper into the actual passage itself to understand. Now, I mentioned some people think this is the one and only time it talks about lesbians because it talks about women exchange natural sexual relations with unnatural ones. As part of exegesis, you need to sometimes break down certain words, and the one that really jumps out to me is unnatural. Now, the Greek word of that is actually paraphysin, which, yes, it can mean unnatural, but if you look at all the different definitions, it kind of paints a slightly different picture. The other definitions are atypical, unusual, peculiar, out of the ordinary, or uncharacteristic, specifically for that time and that place. So the other things that kind of fall into this category of things that would be out of the ordinary for women to do at that time would be to have sex on their period, or to have sex with an uncircumcised man, or to have oral sex, or to have anal sex. Now, the day and age we live in now, those aren't considered wrong. Those aren't considered taboo for the most part. And so if we can't condemn all of those acts, we can't just pick one act that this book might, or this passage might possibly mean when it's actually applying to every single different thing that women were going through in their own kind of sexual acts through worshiping a false idol. Because again, that's the key important part here. But let's talk about the men. So the men were inflamed with lust. And this is so important to understand because Roman culture has actually had a very different view on sex than we do because it was very common for men to have sex with other men. In fact, the idea of intercourse was better translated as penetration of a subordinate by a dominant one, oftentimes through force. So the issue here is not that he's talking about men that are having sex with men, because again, that was very common at the time. What he was talking about was people that are abusing their power and forcing sex upon people that are underneath them, usually they're slaves, because that was legal at the time, that you could force your slave force your slave, whether you were a male or whether your slave was a male or a female, you could force them to have sex with you. And so Paul is saying this abuse of power is what is wrong and what needs to be fixed and corrected. So this idea of this condemnation does not apply to all the LGBTQ plus people if they're not abusing their power to force people to have sex, if they're not worshiping idols, and through that worship doing ritualistic sex. So if they're not doing that, then this passage does not apply to them. But if they are doing that and you want to argue then that is biblically wrong, then sure, that is wrong. But that also applies to men and women that do that in a heterosexual sense as well. All right, so let's look at something else in the New Testament to see if we can try to learn a little bit more. So we're going to go ahead and look at 1 Corinthians, and this is 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. And something kind of interesting happens here. So here it goes. And this is kind of a list of different sinners. Or do you not know that the wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God. So this is a whole list of different people that are sinners that are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. And of course, you heard me say men who have sex with men. Now, this is why I say this is interesting, because sometimes in translations, what they would do is they would take two words that were kind of similar to each other, and to not be so repetitive, they would just lump it up into one word, and that kind of sort of changed throughout translations. And so when they're talking about men who have sex with men, it gets broken down into two words. One word I'm fairly confident on how to say, the other one I might mess it up. But the one word in Greek is malakoi, and this one's a little harder, arsenokoitai. So those are the two words that talked about it in that one sentence, but they kind of lumped it together. So let's break down those two words to kind of help you understand. So malakoi also gets translated as effeminate, but that's not even that accurate either. It's more accurately translated to as soft, referring to a soft man. Now, this was not a homophobic slur. This had nothing to do with how men carried themselves sexually. What this meant was men had a different view of women at the time, and they viewed women as lazier than men and people that valued pleasure over work. So if they found a man that had those traits, like they were lazy or they prefer to have fun than have a better work ethic, then they would be called soft like a woman, which then got translated into effeminate, which then got translated into homosexual. Sometimes this word also does mean male prostitutes, specifically of the younger variety. And again, the problem when you look at that is lust, not love. And so no matter how you break it down, it doesn't really apply to all LGBTQ community. The second word is a little bit harder to translate, but I'll explain kind of how we can figure out this word. So the arsenokoitai is actually two Greek words, one meaning arseno, which is male, and koitus, which means bed. You put those two together, it's the connotation of intercourse in a bed. When you're trying to translate a word, you have to look and see if that particular word appears anywhere else, and that can kind of help you put it into context. As far as the Bible goes, it only appears one other time in 1 Timothy, which we'll look at in a moment. So that's kind of hard to kind of compare and figure out what it means in context. However, if you look at it throughout a bunch of different Greek texts throughout the time that were not the Bible, that word appears many, many times. And in that context, what it talks about is it talks about men who abuse power to have sex with someone, usually through force. So if we apply that to this Bible, again, we're looking at an abuse of power and forcing subordinates to have sex with you. That is the issue that they're talking about here. Now, I mentioned 1 Timothy, so let's go ahead and look at 1 Timothy to see how this word translates into that and see if it kind of makes any more sense. So this is 1 Timothy 1, 10 through 11, and again, there's going to be a little bit of a list here. For the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which he has entrusted me. So there's a couple of a list of some people that are wrong and are not kind of honoring God here. And of course, we see homosexuals in there as well. This is something else that's kind of interesting. When I mention things that get lost in translation, I don't only mean things that get lost way a long time ago. I also mean throughout different versions of the Bible that you guys might have in your own homes. So I'm going to look at those list of people through the different Bibles and kind of explain what they are. If you are familiar with the abbreviations, then you'll be able to follow up with me. If not, you can figure it out. So that list of people in the NRSV says fornicators, sodomites, and slave traders. The King James Version says whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, and for man-stealers. The NASB says immoral men and homosexual men and kidnappers. The ESV says sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, and enslavers. And lastly, the NIV says adulterers and perverts, for slave traders. So it's interesting because some of those actually don't even mention the word homosexual, and you have to wonder why. And again, that's because that word that's used there is the arsenokoitai, which, as I mentioned, does not necessarily mean men that are particularly having sex with men. It means men that are abusing their power. So why are these kind of sins kind of lumped together? And the reason is because it's all one idea. There was a huge problem of sex trafficking and sex slaves being sold to men who were using their power to abuse these sex slaves and force them into having sex with them, male or female. So that's the reason why that gets lumped into with those lists, because they're talking about a specific problem in a specific time with a specific group of people. And that's kind of the key through everything I've read, is why there's no blanket statement that can be used to condemn LGBTQ plus community now. Because there's simply not a blanket statement. There are specific people in specific times doing specific things. And so that's kind of the heart of the message of why I wanted to share this with you today, because for too long, we have heard all these different verses and stuff used against those people in that community. But listen, I'm not here to change anyone's mind, okay? I know I kind of am talking to some Christians out there, but listen, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to make you look at the Bible in a different way. If you do, that's great and that's amazing. But if you're also sitting there and your fingers are ready to write a rebuttal out to me, or you're about to share a link to me of some video, or you're going to make your own video, I'm going to say this as nicely as I can. I don't care. Because I don't care if you need to justify yourself to judge these other people. That does not interest me. It does not interest me in having a conversation further to just make you feel better about how you can judge these people. Something else I want to say that is not as important to me is this is also not me trying to encourage the LGBTQ plus community to go back to church, because that's not that important to me. Now, if you feel this message and you want to go back to church and you find a church that's loving and accepting, then that's amazing and that's great. And I fully support you in that. But that's not my intention. That's not my desire. If you still feel hurt by the church and you don't think you can go back, then that's okay too. But if you only hear one thing today, there's only one message that you get out of this. This is what I want you to hear. Too many times, this book has been used as a tool for hate. Too many times, people have been kicked out of their homes as teenagers or kicked out of their churches because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And the problem is too many people are using this version of the Bible, the version that they take and they rip out certain sections that they don't feel apply to them, or they take certain things that aren't comfortable with them or don't fit their ideas or their standards, and all that they're left with is things that make them feel comfortable in their daily lives and things that make them feel okay to judge people. This is not the Bible that was actually written. The Bible is a book of love. The Bible is the good news. And for too long, it has been used for hate. And so the thing I want to tell people that are in the LGBTQ plus community, and if you've watched this video for this long, maybe it's because you've experienced something like this in your past. It's these hateful words are not written for you. And the really sad thing is, there's probably more people that are upset that I ripped the Bible than the fact that there are teenagers getting kicked out of their homes or kicked out of their churches because of how they live their life. And if that hasn't really driven home for you, let me share some statistics, and maybe this might make the sense a little bit more important to you. Gay teens are 8.4 times more likely to report having attempted suicide and 5.9 times more likely to report high levels of depression. LGBT youth who reported higher levels of family rejection during adolescence are 3 times more likely to use illegal drugs. Half of gay males experience a negative parental reaction when they come out, and 26% of those people were kicked out of their homes. Studies indicate that between 25 and 50% of homeless youth that are out there on the streets now are LGBTQ+. And they're on the streets because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And let me break down that percentage, because maybe that doesn't really drive the point home of how many that really is. That breaks down to 320,000 to 400,000 teens. And when I say teens, I mean the average age is 14 years old. And of all of those numbers, 62% of them have attempted suicide. This is not okay. This is a book of love. And it has to stop being a book of hate. And listen, to the LGBTQ plus community out there, I can't change people's minds. I can't influence how they read their book or encourage them to change their lifestyles. And sadly, I can't go back in time and change the way that I used to think when I was in church, or change the things I said about you when I was in church. But what I can do is tell you, all this hate and the scriptures that they read are not written about you. Because according to the Bible that I read, you are loved. Now, there's another reason I wanted to share this message today, and it's a little bit more personal for me. And that's because I wanted to heal this book, and I mean this Bible specifically. Because right here on the cover, it says Jose T. Navarro. That's my father, who passed away about 11 years ago. For many years of his life, he was a pastor, and he raised me and my sister to be in the church, and for many years we were. But also, my father's greatest fear was that I was gay. And I don't mean that flippantly, I mean that very specifically. See, when I was about 14 years old, I was, and I still am, extremely painfully shy, to the point where I only had about 2 male friends and had absolutely no love interest on the horizon. And my dad had a hard time understanding this, because when he was my age, he was really popular and had apparently all the ladies and all the friends and everything. So, I remember one day, and I don't remember the exact reason for it, but I was really emotional, like I was most of the time back then, and I was crying, which my father always took as a sign of weakness and being effeminate. So on this particular night, my dad comes into my room, and the one thing he wanted to know is if I was crying because I was gay. And I, of course, told him I wasn't, because I'm not. But he didn't believe me. It took me a really long time to try to convince him that I wasn't gay. And he told me, you have to tell me if you're gay, because if you are, you're getting kicked out of this house. Now, to those of you guys that have experienced this and have been kicked out of your own home, I obviously can't fully understand the pain that you've gone through. But that night showed me a glimpse of it. Because for the first time in my life, I understood that my father's love for me was not unconditional, like I always thought it was. Like I'm sure many, many kids out there, when you're born into your family, you think your parents will love you no matter what. And my dad was telling me that's not true. And that drastically altered our relationship going forward. A couple years later, something happened to me that kind of made sense why my dad had this fear. So I was about 16, 17 years old, and I was driving home, and I had a suppressed memory out of nowhere just unlock in my head. And it hit me so hard, I had to pull over the side of the road, and I just wept in the car for like 10 or 15 minutes, and I was so terrified of going home because of this memory that had opened up in my head. The memory was this. I was about 4 or 5 years old. I don't know exactly how old I was, but I was young enough that I wasn't old enough to go to school yet, if that makes sense. At the time, we lived up in the Santa Cruz Mountains in a very small community. And since I couldn't go to school, my really only option was to hang out with the other people that were my age. In particular, there was this one boy, and I think his name was Blake, so I'm going to call him Blake. Blake and I were the same age, and we hung out together a lot, and I would consider him my best friend at that time. One day, Blake very innocently asked, "Hey, why don't we get naked?" And I thought, yeah, that's fine. Why not? So we got naked and we were playing together. His brother caught us and thought it was weird, so he told on us. Now, I don't know what their punishment was, but I can tell you what my punishment was. My father's reaction to this news, again, as a 4 or 5-year-old, was to pack me a backpack, force me to pick one teddy bear, and he drove me to the bottom of the mountain, opened the door, and kicked me out of the car, and told me that he was kicking me out of the family, and he was going to leave me on the side of the road. I don't know what I did wrong, but I knew I did something wrong, so I did the only thing I could do, and I said I was sorry, and I promised I would never do it again. He accepted that. We went back home. Now again, because I don't know what I did wrong, it happened again. And again, my father drove me down to the bottom of the mountain, opened the door, kicked me out of the car, and said he was leaving me on the side of the road. By this point, I had kind of figured out, okay, this had something to do with me getting naked with Blake, so I won't do it again. So I promised again I would never do it again, and I didn't. However, because we lived in the mountains with forest all around us, one day Blake and I had to pee, so we just peed out in the forest. And this just so happened to be the time my dad was looking for me, and he turned the corner and saw both of us with our penises exposed, and he viewed it as a homosexual act. And that was the first time I ever heard the word gay. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it had something to do with me, this other boy, and something to do with our naked bodies. I tried to explain to him I was just going to the bathroom, but he didn't believe me. And for the 3rd time, drove me down to the bottom of the mountain and kicked me out of the car and said he was going to kick me out of the family and leave me there. I promised again I wouldn't do it. And he believed me, drove me back up home. And the only way I could prevent that from happening again was I had to stop being friends with Blake. And eventually we moved away from that community and life went on, and I forgot that memory for a really long time. But I don't think my father forgot that memory, which is why it apparently haunted him. And every time he saw me crying, he probably remembered that and thought, this is the moment my son is going to tell me that I'm gay. And this is the moment I'm finally going to kick him out of the family. Now listen, I don't share those stories to speak ill of the dead, because in truth, something happened that was kind of personal in our lives that changed our relationship for the better. And me and my father grew very close to one another. And the last 7 years of his life, I considered him one of my best friends. And to this day, I love him and I miss him terribly. But the other important thing that tells me is, I think during that period of when we were really close, if I was gay and I had come out, I don't think he would have kicked me out of the family then. And what that tells me is that people can change. So parents, if you're watching this and you've experienced something like this where you've kicked your own children out of the house for this exact same reason, I can't fully understand how you could do something like that to your kids, but I can understand how you would read the certain things in this Bible and think they were wrong and think as a good Christian person you have to distance yourself from that sin. But hopefully you get a tiny bit of an idea of understanding that they are not wrong and that they should be loved. And that's your responsibility to love them. And it's not too late to beg forgiveness of your children and pray that your family can be whole again. Because this is a book of love. And even if you have an edited version of the Bible where you've ripped out things that don't apply to you, you probably still have a lot of passages about love in there. And so I shouldn't have to tell you that the greatest commandment is love. I shouldn't have to tell you that love is patient and love is kind. I shouldn't have to tell you if you have faith that can move mountains, but you don't have love, you are nothing. And I shouldn't have to tell you that 1 Timothy 5:8 says, "But if anyone does not provide for their relatives, and especially members of their household, then he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." But I shouldn't have to tell you that, because you should know that this is a book of love. And so to the LGBTQ people out there, I want you to understand one very, very important thing. And that's this: you are loved by a mother and a father, even if it's not your own. This is my wife, Kelsey, and we have 2 wonderful children that we are raising to love everybody, which qualifies us as a mother and a father. So if you need somebody to talk to, leave a message here. Find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram. I'll leave the information in the link below. Talk to us, and we will talk to you. And more importantly, we will love you. And to my straight friends out there, if this message has moved you in some way, I hope you share this with other people. But more importantly, I hope you take a moment to sort of out yourself as an ally to the LGBTQ plus community, because there needs to be more allies. There needs to be more voices heard that say we love you. And if anyone else is as impacted about all those lost teens out there like I am, then I would suggest joining with us in volunteering for the Trevor Project, which offers life-saving support for LGBTQ plus teens. And for everybody out there, we love you.
We love you.
And everybody, I hope you can love everybody else. Thank you.